Good morning. I am delighted to be here with respected colleagues in this panel and also very good friends. The presentation which is coming here follows a little bit on what Liliana was saying and starts moving, stays in the macro, but it will, I think, pre-announce some of the micro things that Santiago Levy will discuss. The motivating issue is what Liliana was mentioning. Let's see if we can get this done. Is that we're back to low growth. That's Latin America before the magnificent years of the 2000s. And as you see, we're basically back to zero in some sense. Latin America is confronted again with the traditional Latin American problem. It's low growth. And we got a bit of an excitement in the last 10 years that now seems to be disappearing. So if I run out of time, I want to write here the main points I'd like to leave with you, the main messages of this presentation, which is work that I'm doing with Analyse, and it's in some sense work in progress. First, we find in the data, as well as in the concepts, that growth is not just about supply. Economists like to think of long-term growth essentially as a supply side issue, where growth is driven by investment prospects and profits. And who finances those investments, economists tend to think, it doesn't matter. Whether it's financed by foreign savings or local savings, it should not matter. That's the traditional view of economists. What we're essentially saying is that whether you finance your investment in growth with foreign or domestic savings matters, and it has an impact on growth. And it matters through three main channels, and I'll explain them a little bit later. First, low savings, which is a demand component. Low savings affects growth through the competitiveness channel. Low savings tends to reduce the competitiveness of your real exchange rate. And that has effects on growth, and I'll explain this a little bit. Second, low savings, by creating current account deficits, which Liliana mentioned, can begin to produce vulnerabilities for the balance of payments. And the more the vulnerabilities in the balance of payments happen, the more the risk premium the country will have to pay will rise. And so low savings can have an effect on growth via balance of payments sustainability effects. And third, savings can also affect growth because we know, as a matter of fact, that savings goes up as growth happens. But once growth and savings are correlated, then savings will have an additional multiplier effect on growth through the channels that I mentioned earlier. So we explore these three channels through which low savings can affect growth, and I'll give you some of the results. This view is dissonant with the mainstream economic literature, because in the mainstream, let's take a neoclassical traditional growth model. What those models tend to imply is that saving does not matter for the equilibrium real exchange rate, and it doesn't matter for growth. That savings, domestic and foreign savings, tend to be substitute. In fact, the neoclassical growth model predicts that the more you grow, the less you save, because the prospects of being richer in the future make you save less. So that way of thinking is inconsistent with well-established observations. And part of what we're doing is trying to see how we reconcile theory with observations in this regard. This is a long debate, and I'm not going to get into this. You have a paper for that. It's a long debate. But I think if you want to look at the pieces of the debate, it goes more or less like that. Nobody questions the fact that savings and growth go together. Countries that save more grow more. Countries that save less grow less. We know that. There's plenty of evidence of that. We also know that countries that save more invest more. That's the Feldstein-Horioka puzzle, right? He wonders why is it that the investment is not financed more by foreign savings, given capital mobility. So we know the correlation exists, but there's a huge debate as to which impacts what. What's the direction of causality? And I think it's fair to say that most economists think that savings, rather than causing growth, actually follows growth. So I'm going to make the reverse argument. I'm going to say, of course, savings follows growth, but also it causes growth through the channels that I was mentioning before. This is important to reconcile because when you talk to policymakers, they have the sneaky feeling, which I think is correct, that low savings and therefore large current account deficits are bad for your health. They sooner or later will undermine growth. Policymakers know that in their heart. And yet, when they read traditional economics literature, they don't find an echo to their beliefs. So by doing this, I think what we're finding in this research is that by thinking that once you posit that saving affects growth, you have to accept that foreign and domestic savings are not substitutes. Deep down, the reason why foreign domestic savings are not perfect substitutes is the same reason of what you will see when Santiago speaks. You see in the world huge dispersion of productivities between countries and across firms within the country. Neoclassical theory would say that factors would move to their best uses so that the productivity of factors would tend to equalize across firms and across countries. We know that that's not the case. We don't observe the equalization of factor productivity across firms and across countries. So this is an important point because what I'm going to tell you, in a sense, provides a link between macro, why does saving matter, and micro, why do we have such huge and persistent dispersions in productivity. So I have a set of arrows and things like that to try to explain the three channels, which I'm not going to show you because you can read that at your leisure. So I'm going to try to give you the intuition of the three channels through which low savings can affect growth. First, the competitiveness channels. How does it work? Well, low savings means that expenditure is exceeding income. So when aggregate demand exceeds income, some of that demand goes into imports. But if you're a small country, you can import at a given international prices. The price of import doesn't change because a country is importing more. However, the excess demand over income, when it falls on domestic goods, it raises the prices of domestic goods. And that's precisely what the real appreciation is. Now, once the real appreciation has happened, if factors don't move fast enough, which is what the micro evidence tell us, then the equilibrium real exchange rate will be lasting. So a low savings will appreciate the exchange rate, and that appreciation will last for a while, and that will undercut growth through a competitiveness channels. Why? Because an appreciated real exchange rate will make people invest more and do more activity in the non-tradable sector instead of in tradable industries. And we have this sneaky feeling that tradable industries are better conduit to learn, for investment, for technology diffusion. And so to the extent that tradable sector generates more learning externalities, more investment impetus, and more learning by investment externalities, then you lose growth potential by specializing in non-tradables. That is the competitiveness channel. The interest rate, what we call the interest rate channel, which is the sustainability channel, works the reverse. In the first case, what you would expect is that if this competitive channel is dominating, you will see countries that save less, grow less, and have an overvalued exchange rate. That's what you would see if that channel dominates. The interest rate channel works slightly differently. You save less, your current account deficit becomes bigger, you start financing, you start borrowing, but as you borrow more, you begin to have higher risk of default. And so the country risk may go up if people think that this is not sustainable, that your current account deficits are not sustainable. That will raise risk premium, a country risk premium, therefore that will raise the cost of capital and will bring down investment. If the sustainability problems materialize and you have a crisis, the crisis will by itself undercut growth. So when this interest rate channel dominates, low savings will be associated with low growth, but the exchange rate in this case would be undervalued because the sustainability problems will make your exchange rate to be rather weak. And so where the interest rate channel dominates, you'll have a different pattern. You have low savings, low growth, but undervalued real exchange rates. And the third channel is the one that I mentioned, growth leads to different savings rates. And once the saving rate changes, it affects growth through the channels that I mentioned. So those are the three channels. That's the intuition, and this is the little graphs that help that. Bottom line, when you run the regressions and you look at the data, and we have been looking at the data until we're blue in our faces, what you find are some important results. First, the effect, we do in effect find that low savings lead to low growth, longer term, not just in the short run, longer term, lead to lower growth. Let's see if I can show you this. This effect seems to be much higher for middle income countries. This is possibly because the reason why low savings affect growth is because there is insufficient factor mobility. Maybe as countries become better markets and more developed, there's more factor mobility, so these effects lose power as you go into a richer country. So it's mainly a middle income effect. And it seems asymmetric. So low savings affects growth more when you tend to be in current account deficit territory, the bigger your current account deficit is. So the more you're in surplus, then the marginal benefits of saving more are not as high. And when you look at impacts, we are trying to detect impacts by instrumenting these variables because there's so much endogeneity in this data. But when you try to instrument, we have been successful in instrumenting to some extent this, and you get big impacts. So if Latin America would raise the saving rate to be equal to those of Asia, the saving rate in Asia, we can get that around 1 to 2 additional points of growth, given the data. So let me show you a little bit of the data. This is okay, I need to explain this graph a little bit. So in this graph, you have the savings along the vertical axis, and does this work? No. Each dot is a country in a period. Since we're looking at long-term growth, long-term relations, each period is an average of 3 years. Okay, so I have to finish very quickly. So what you see is that in the sample as a whole, on average, in the world, you see this pattern. Countries that oversave, that are above the horizontal axis, and countries that are that oversave tend to have an exchange rate that is undervalued, and they grow more. So you want to know exactly what happens in each of these areas. I am done. So there's no way I can show you all of these results, but I want to tell you a little bit of the main messages for Latin America. So when you look at this data and you see where Latin America has been, this is a story you can tell. In the 90s and in the 80s, low savings in Latin America led to low growth, mainly through the interest rate channel. It made our balance of payments less viable, more vulnerable. We had a lot of financial crisis, and that's how low savings affected growth. In the last 10 years, however, Latin America has become a better asset class, like Liliana was mentioning. And therefore, what happens with our balance of payments has become more resilient. But our exchange rates have appreciated a lot in the last 10 years. So low savings may be now affecting Latin America's growth more now, to the extent that our balance of payments remain viable. Low savings will be affecting Latin America more through the external competitiveness channel. What that means is that we have a huge and very complicated policy issue. You see, now, as Liliana was saying, we need to adjust to the external situations. And that means that we need to play well with our macro policy. What these type of results are telling us is that the best way to adjust would be tightening the fiscal and loosening the monetary, because tightening the fiscal will create a more robust saving environment that would help long-term growth. Loosening the monetary, as you tighten the fiscal, will allow a lower interest rate and investment will pick up. Now, that is what the doctor orders. It would be consistent, it would make consistency between the short run and the long run. However, politics are against that. Politics are in favor of what Liliana was saying. Let's borrow. Markets are liquid. They are willing to take our bonds. So we may, in that process, continue to create this bias for either lower competitive real exchange rates or perhaps vulnerable balance of payments. So if we don't adjust well to this cycle, we will be undercutting our capacity to grow in the future by either one of the two channels. Doing this well is, however, monstrously difficult because you have to do a fiscal effort. and that's not popular. And somebody has to consume less today so that savings can raise and you can get this trick. And that is plagued with tensions. So, basic point. Let us not forget about macro. Aggregate demand management not only matters for short-run cyclical fluctuations, it also matters for long-term growth. Doing the things right in the short run will matter for what happens long-term growth. The additional kick is that you do a more saving effort today, even your counter-cyclical policy will be better in the future because countries that save more can do better also in the short run in counter-cyclical policy management. One final point. Growth will be at the core of the discussion in Latin America going forward. And Latin Americans are not very good at discussing growth. But as we go we are learning in the World Bank now that as we prepare for the next annual meetings in Lima, which will happen in 4 decades, I think it's the first time we have annual meetings of World Bank and IMF in Lima, we are finding out that the demand is for discussions of growth and how to link short-term to long-term growth issues. So the World Bank has opened a hashtag that's called Road to Lima or Rumbo a Lima. And the idea of this hashtag is to try to promote a conversation on the real issues that Latin America needs to discuss for the future. And I almost bet that growth will be at the center. Thank you.